rambling answers, even asking Trump's lawyers, quote, "Can you control your client? This is not a political rally." Mr. Trump testified at one point, quote, "I became president because of my brand." New York Attorney General Letitia James accuses the former president, his sons, and the Trump Organization of lying about the value of the business.
Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump both testified last week. Ivanka Trump, who's not a defendant in this case, is expected to take the stand on Wednesday. We have team coverage of today's testimony. NBC's Lindsay Reiser is outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos here in studio with us, and NBC News senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson is with us in Washington. A star panel here. Let me go to Lindsay first. The former president will be back on the stand just a few minutes from now, I understand, after the lunch break ends. What have we heard, if you can summarize, so far today?
We've heard some similar defenses that we heard in the video deposition taken in April related to this case. For example, he wasn't involved in the nitty-gritty of appraisals and valuations. He relied on other people. Those statements of financial condition that the Attorney General's office says contain overvaluations leading to better loan terms and lower interest rates didn't cost anybody anything. That's what Trump is saying, and that they're meaningless to banks, that they have a disclaimer clause and the banks know they have to do their own due diligence. And he's also said multiple times that those statements didn't contain his biggest asset, and that is his brand. Now, in addition to what we're hearing in terms of his defense, is really some fireworks between the judge and the defense team. Essentially, Judge Goran, as you mentioned, asking Trump attorney Chris Kise to control his client at one point, after doing this several times, saying every time the former president would go off and non-responsive answers that he would take a negative inference as a result. Remember, the judge in this case has already ruled that Trump and his co-defendants are liable for fraud. A lot of this is determining other issues like insurance fraud, falsification of business records, and the amount of damages. The Attorney General's office is asking for $250 million. And just one more thing, really stunning, that Trump on the stand is pointed essentially to the judge, stared straight ahead. In addition to calling this a witch hunt, he said he called me a fraud, referring to the judge, and he didn't know anything about me. The fraud is on the court, not me. Kate and Zinclay.
Lindsay, thank you. Danny, I want to turn to you because, of course, you're an attorney, right? You've been in court many times. How unusual is it for the judge to admonish a witness of the defense team?
Oh, it happens more than you might think, and sometimes I feel like it happens to me more than I expect it should happen to. But look, defense attorneys always feel that way. The paranoia is sort of baked into the business because, yeah, we sometimes feel that judges are giving us a hard time. Sometimes the prosecution feels that way. Same thing in civil cases. What's different here is the willingness of both attorney and witness, the client, Donald Trump, to push back against the judge. I submit that were this happening with anyone else, some no-name witness or client or defendant on the stand, the sanctions would already be flying. And with Donald Trump, you have to be careful because I believe judges really would prefer not to have to sanction him in the form of even sending him to jail, because that would be an administrative nightmare and it would create more trouble than it would solve.
Danny, when we mentioned the judge asked Mr. Trump's lawyer to control his client, the response from the lawyer was it would be more economical to just let him give his answers. Substantively, what are we hearing from Mr. Trump? Like, what are they trying to argue?
You're hearing nothing that we didn't expect to hear. And in a sense, Trump's testimony is consistent with his children's testimony. And we always knew what that was going to be. It was going to be some variation of, yes, I may be the boss, but I wasn't really paying attention to this stuff. I rely on the accountants. It's literally the only thing that these witnesses can testify to that will be in their best interests and possibly truthful. So there is no surprise from Donald Trump on the substance. On the fighting back with the judge, yes, there's a surprise to the extent he's being just so out there about it. And his attorneys appear very emboldened as well. The one thing I would take issue with Justice Goran is whenever a judge says, control your client. This is a perfect example. There are uncontrollable clients. This is Exhibit A in the uncontrollable client category.
Okay, so Hallie, let's zone in on the client right now. Former President Donald Trump. Of course, we are now officially less than a year from the 2024 presidential election somehow. And so far, it looks like Trump's various legal cases are not really hurting him politically. We do have new polling from key battleground states to kind of back that up. But just walk us through these numbers and what it might mean for Trump.
Definitely. And I love the way that Danny phrased this, Zinkley, the idea of what is uncontrollable when it relates to a client, the former president, and what is controllable, because there's so much that happens in politics that we can't necessarily game out here a year before the election. However, we are looking at this set of polls, right, that is, frankly, not good for President Biden and does show a lot of strength here for former President Trump, at least in these key battleground states. And you can see the former president, based on this New York Times Siena polling, in a hypothetical matchup next year, has him leading in every state except Wisconsin, where it is just a slim 2-point margin that is, I believe, just about within or just outside the margin of error there. So very, very close race is what these polls are showing in battlegrounds. Now, you're seeing the Trump campaign seize on this, specifically when you get into, not to nerd out, but what they call the crosstabs, get into the demographic makeup of the people that were spoken to for this poll, showing that, for example, black voter support has eroded to a degree for President Biden. These are alarm bells for some in the Democratic Party. The Biden campaign is pushing back very hard on this, basically saying, hey, wait a second, this is not freak out time yet. We are still a year out from the election. Polls are rarely predictive this far out. I talked to a senior campaign official who pointed out to me, listen, former President Obama was trailing in polls before he ultimately ended up winning the elections that he won. There is still so much that can change. And keep in mind, Democrats will say, look at the 2022 midterms, when Democrats were predicted to have a far worse night than they actually had, right? So are people paying attention? Are people super engaged in the 2024 matchup right now? Typically, we don't see that happen until even 8 months from now, past the conventions, when folks really start to engage in the political landscape. However, and again, we don't know what's going to happen in the next year. There are some things. The economy. We know that that is driving these poor poll numbers for President Biden and the stronger poll numbers for former President Trump. More people in this poll say that they trust Donald Trump on the economy more so than Joe Biden. Over the next year, what does the economy look like? Does the pace of inflation continue to slow? Does the rate of unemployment stay relatively low? What happens with interest rates, which affect people in their budgets? Look at the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, for example, Russia's invasion. And then, of course, what we're talking about here, the former president's criminal trials and this civil trial. We don't know the outcomes yet. Obviously, it hasn't hurt the former president now. We'll see what happens a year from now, Kate and Zinkley.
Yeah, an important point. There's still a lot of time between now and then. Hallie Jackson, Danny Savalos, and Lindsay Reiser on the ground there. Thank you all so much. And, of course, you can see more of Hallie Jackson tonight on Hallie Jackson Now, streaming right here at 5 p.m. Eastern.
You don't know when your moment's coming.